Nick Diaz has been in some of the most entertaining fights in MMA history. He's also one of the most respected fighters in the game due to his style of fighting and his I don't give a f attitude. But due to the rise in popularity from his brother Nate Diaz, I feel like not many know what really happened in Nick's career and how good he actually was. Hey guys, it's Kiiyon and today I'm going to be talking about MMA legend Nick Diaz. Like I said, since the rise of his brother Nate, Nick Diaz has taken a step back from the MMA spotlight. But at one point he was the more popular Diaz brother. So let's take a look at Nick Diaz's career and how good he actually was. Nick Diaz made his pro debut the same month he turned 18 back in 2001. That night he would defeat Mike Swick by submission, and in his second pro fight, he would win the IFC United States Welterweight Championship against Chris Lytle. In this fight, Nick controlled Lytle with the clinch, and when he took the fight to the ground, he threw some nice shots from the top. Even on his back, he would be attacking with submissions. The fight also showed how durable Nick was in both taking a punch and his cardio. On September 8, 2012, Diaz fought in the King of the Mountain welterweight tournament. He was able to secure the quarterfinal and semifinal victory against Blaine Tyler and Adam Lynn respectively. In the finals, he fought Jeremy Jackson. Moments into that fight, Nick got clipped by a jab and was finished on the floor via strikes. The fight lasted 49 seconds. Nick would finish 2002 off by picking up a TKO win against Harris Sarmiento and then dropping a split decision against Kuniyoshi Hiranaka. Then in March of 2003, Diaz beat Joe Hurley by Kimura to win the first ever WEC welterweight championship, a belt that he would later vacate. He went back to the IFC to defend his belt against Jeremy Jackson, the first man to ever beat him. This time around, Nick was able to control the fight with his grappling. In fact, during this time, Nick was more of a ground fighter than a striker. He would always pursue the clinch and either go for the takedown or fall into guard, as he had a strong jiu-jitsu game when on his back. In this fight, he was able to secure the takedown in the first round, work his way into the full mount, and throw strikes from above before the ref saw enough. Nick Diaz avenged his first loss and retained his IFC championship. That would be his final defense before being signed by the UFC in September of that same year. His first fight with the promotion would be the rubber match with Jeremy Jackson. In a back and forth fight, Diaz was able to secure the armbar 2 minutes into the third round that forced Jeremy to tap immediately. Following his UFC debut, he would go on to fight highly touted prospect Robbie Lawler, who was a favorite going into the fight with Nick Diaz. This fight was an absolute war. Both fighters were throwing bombs at each other. It was also one of Nick's first fights where he stood and didn't really try to take his opponent to the ground. He was also more vocal with his taunting and trash talk. And finally, in the second, Diaz landed a right hook that knocked out Robbie Lawler immediately. After losing a controversial split decision to Karo Parisian, Nick would pick up 2 first-round wins when he defeated Drew Fickett and Koji Oishi. Nick Diaz was set to fight Ultimate Fighter Season 1 winner Diego Sanchez, who was 13-0 at the time. Prior to the fight, Nick questioned why Diego climbed the UFC ranks so fast in regards to being in the main event so quickly and being paid more than Diaz. Diego would take down Nick throughout the fight and land shots from above. Nick would lose the fight by unanimous decision. After, he would lose to Joe Riggs in a close fight by decision. What's notable about this fight was after, when both fighters were taken to the hospital and the trash talk continued. This would result into the two fighting again, which forced hospital security to separate the two. He would then lose another close fight to Sean Shirk at UFC 59 before returning back home to Stockton, California to pick up a win outside of the UFC promotion. Then the UFC called him on short notice to fight Josh Neer at UFC 62. Diaz got the call a night before the fight, but still impressed with the third round Kimura. He returned at UFC 65 where he fought Gleison Tibau. After being controlled by Tibau in the beginning of the round, Nick was able to reverse and throw heavy ground and pound to end the round. In the second, Nick was able to stuff Tibau's takedowns and knock him to the ground with an uppercut. From there, Nick would throw a flurry of punches that didn't look like it had the most power, but the volume proved to be too much, causing the ref to stop the fight. Following this fight, Nick Diaz left the UFC to sign with Gracie Fighting Championships. But the event he was supposed to be on was cancelled due to poor ticket sales. He would then sign a 2-fight deal with Pride and make his debut against Takanori Gomi, who at this point was considered as one of the best lightweights in the world. The non-title bout took place at 160 pounds, a first for the welterweight Nick Diaz. In the first round, Gomi was able to take down Diaz and land some shots from above. And when the fight got up, Gomi stunned Diaz with a right hand but was unable to finish Nick on the ground. When the fight was brought back up, Diaz displayed some really nice boxing by maintaining his distance and picking his shots that accurately landed on the fading Gomi. The fight quickly became a war with Diaz throwing the volume and Takanori looking for that one power shot. In the second round, Gomi would go for a takedown that would lead him into a gogoplata Nevada submission by Nick. But it was later announced by the Nevada State Athletic Commission that Nick failed his drug test after testing positive for marijuana. Commission Chairman Dr. Tony Alamo would say that the high amount of THC in Nick's system made him numb to the pain that he took in the fight. Diaz was fined 20% of his win money and the result was changed to a no contest. In 2007, Diaz signed with EliteXC and won his debut in a close fight against Mike Aina. His next fight was for the 160-pound title against KJ Nunes. Diaz would land some nice shots and attempt some takedowns early into the fight, but Nunes would stuff them, and on one of them landed a knee that cut Nick badly above his eye. The blood from the cut would get into the face of Nick, and Nunes capitalized by landing a counter straight right that put Nick into the floor. But Diaz was still able to survive and even throw some nice shots until the end of the round. That's when the doctor looked at the cut more and decided to call the fight. Diaz was not happy and gave middle fingers to the doctor on his way out. Following this, Diaz fought Katsuya Inui in Japanese MMA promotion Dream. He would win the fight when Katsuya's corner threw in the towel after Nick was being really aggressive from the start with his striking and pressuring. Nick went on to fight Musin Corbry, who was 9 pounds overweight, on an EliteXC card in Hawaii. Both fighters threw nice combos against each other. The fight continued to prove that Diaz was so good at taking a punch. In the third round, Diaz took Musin to the ground and attempted an array of submissions before securing the mount and finishing the fight with strikes. In the main event of that same card, a victorious KJ Nunes would meet with Nick Diaz in the cage to discuss the rematch. KJ Nunes' father Carl would begin to press Nick, and after Nate Diaz threw a water bottle at Carl, a chaos would ensue. Nick and his team would leave the arena, giving middle fingers on the way out. Nick's last fight with the promotion was against Thomas Denny, which was in his hometown of Stockton, California. After Denny started the fight strong, Nick would take over by attacking with submissions and striking with lots of volume. Nick's striking at this point was so good because the combination of his accuracy and stamina would quickly change the fight's momentum to his favor. After an absolute beatdown, Diaz ended the fight early into the second round. This was Nick's last fight with the promotion because Strikeforce would acquire EliteXC, take its roster, and seize the company's operations. Before all this happened, Nick Diaz was scheduled to fight Eddie Alvarez. Imagine if that fight happened. Who do you think would have won? Anyways, Nick made his Strikeforce debut by headlining the card against former UFC light heavyweight champion Frank Shamrock. The fight was at a catchweight of 179 pounds. In the first round, Nick would take down Shamrock, attempt a submission, and throw irritating strikes from above. In the second round, Diaz turned up the volume with his striking, which quickly tired out Frank. At this point, the taunting Diaz would land a body shot that would drop Shamrock, where he would finish it by strikes on the floor. His next fight was against Scott Smith, and immediately Nick started strong and began trash talking. This set the tone for the rest of the fight, where Diaz would continue to throw a bunch of strikes. Scott Smith would rely on his power shots, and he did land some, but Nick seemed unfazed when they landed. Smith would attempt to take down Nick, but Diaz was effective in stopping them or popping back up when taken down. Diaz continued the pressure in the third, where he landed a nice liver shot that dropped Scott. From there, Nick would secure the rear naked choke. Diaz would go on to fight Mariusz Zaromskis for the inaugural Strikeforce welterweight championship. The fight was a slugfest from the start. Mariusz would land a left hand that dropped Nick, and it looked like it was going to be finished. But Diaz survived and began tagging Zaromskis with shots and landing knees to the leg. Mariusz was absolutely tired near the end of that round, and that's when Nick began going to work by landing shots to the head and body. He would finish Mariusz before the end of the first with a right hook that immediately stopped the fight. At the end, when the commentator asked if the win was special to Nick, he said he didn't care as he was looking forward to going home and eating. And honestly, he seemed so genuine about it that I believed him. And I think this was a big reason people began liking Nick Diaz, was because it seemed like he didn't care about the fame or glory. He just wanted to fight because he liked it, he was good at it, and it made him money. In May of 2010, Nick would go back to Japan to fight Hayato Sakurai. Nick would quickly take Sakurai down and begin landing shots to the head and body. Eventually it got back up and Hayato landed a powerful right hand, but Nick didn't even buckle. Sakurai would go for a takedown of his own, but while on the bottom, Diaz would work his way into an armbar. After this fight, Nick Diaz was set to defend his Strikeforce belt in a rematch against KJ Nunes. The fight was a 5-round war where both Nick and KJ stood toe-to-toe, throwing strikes back and forth. In this fight, Nick showed the high pressure he could place on his opponents regardless of getting tagged with shots. The momentum favored Diaz towards the end of the fight and was eventually awarded with the unanimous decision victory from the judges. In 2011, he defended his belt 2 more times. First defense was against Evangelista Santos, where after weathering the powerful kicks and punches, Diaz gained the momentum with his volume boxing that quickly tired out Santos. In the final 30 seconds of the second round, Diaz was taken down but immediately locked in the armbar off his back. Evangelista's wife Cyborg was devastated. Nick's second title defense of 2011 was against Paul Daly. The fight started like many of Nick's other fights, bombs being thrown back and forth. Daly even landed a hook that dropped Nick, but we all know by now that Nick can take a hit. And the narrative was also similar to his previous fights in that his opponents would use up all their energy trying to finish the fight early. But Diaz conserves his energy while throwing a huge volume of strikes that gets his opponents to constantly think and therefore get tired faster. Paul landed another hook that seemed to have Diaz in all sorts of trouble. But after Nick recovered and stood back up, Daly was exhausted. Diaz would go on to finish Paul on the ground by strikes before the first round ended. At this point, Nick Diaz was one of the best welterweights in the world outside of the UFC, which made a fight between Nick Diaz and UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre a must-see. Dana White would announce that Nick Diaz signed with the UFC. He vacated his Strikeforce belt and was going to fight George St. Pierre at UFC 137. But when the UFC set up a press tour to promote the fight, Nick Diaz did not attend them, and this got Dana White so mad that he pulled Diaz from the fight and replaced him with Carlos Condit. Instead, Diaz fought former UFC lightweight and welterweight champion BJ Penn. His UFC comeback was successful after Diaz took over the fight in the final 2 rounds with his crazy striking output. After earning the unanimous decision victory, Nick would go off in the post-fight interview by calling out GSP with the famous line, "Where you at, George?" And even though the fight between the two was set for UFC 143, St. Pierre pulled out due to an ACL injury. Instead, he fought fellow top contender Carlos Condit, who was supposed to fight GSP at UFC 137 for the belt, but the fight was cancelled after George pulled out from injury. After George's series of injuries, the UFC announced that the bout between Diaz and Condit would be for the interim welterweight championship. So the fight went down on February the 4th, 2012. The fight was super close, with Diaz pressuring forward for most of the fight, landing some nice combos that landed, and some may even argue made Condit run away. But Condit was countering with some nice combos of his own, and by the end of the fight, had more significant strikes landed. So depending on how you scored the fight, you either took into account Nick's pressure or Condit's significant strikes. Ultimately, Carlos Condit won the fight by unanimous decision, but many believe Diaz got robbed. Nick was so upset that he contemplated retirement after the fight. It was his first loss in 5 years. This fight spawned the meme Diaz 1, 2, and 5 in the MMA community in regards to the rounds people believed he won. A rematch between the two was supposed to happen, but Nick tested positive for marijuana metabolites. Diaz was suspended for 1 year and fined 30% of his purse from the fight. The year suspension kind of worked out in a way because after GSP came back to defeat and defend his belt against Carlos Condit, George requested that he defend his belt next against Nick Diaz, as that's what the fans wanted to see originally. The UFC agreed, and even though Nick was coming off a loss, he finally fought for the belt at UFC 158. The fight was huge, both attendance-wise, which was in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, the home of George St. Pierre, and in pay-per-view sales, which received 950,000 buys. And I have to give credit to Nick, who seemed to really have gotten into George's head with all the trash talk prior to the fight, because GSP was angrier with Nick unlike any other opponent that he's had. But George's grappling proved to be too much for Nick, who would consistently take down Diaz and throw ground and pound from the top. On the feet, George was able to distance Diaz with the jab and connect with a couple of Superman punches. Nick was able to stuff some of St. Pierre's takedowns and land some nice shots to the head and body. But he wasn't able to pressure George like he normally did with his other opponents. By the time the fight ended after 5 rounds, Diaz raised GSP's arm, knowing he came up short in that fight. Diaz lost the fight by unanimous decision. On July 28, 2013, Diaz announced that he was retiring, but Dana White believed it to only be a hiatus and that he would return soon. And he was right, because Nick Diaz came out of retirement to fight former UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva at 185 pounds. I said this in my Anderson Silva video, and I'll say it again. This was one of the weirdest matchups the UFC ever made. It was Anderson's first fight following a year-long layoff from his surgery, and Nick Diaz, who was coming off 2 losses and fighting for the first time in over a year and a half. The fight was even more odd, with very little action from both sides and more taunting from Nick Diaz, who busted out this move in the middle of the fight. The entire fight was on the feet and both men landed their respective shots, but Silva was able to get the unanimous decision victory in the end. Following this fight, it was not only announced that Silva tested positive for 2 types of steroids, but Diaz also failed the drug test when he tested for marijuana again. The decision of the fight was changed to a no contest. Diaz, however, received one of the biggest suspensions in MMA history when the Nevada State Athletic Commission suspended him for 5 years. He also had to pay a fine of $165,000. Many MMA fans thought this was an unfair punishment for Diaz. Even singer Cher expressed her support for Nick by sending out a tweet asking the commission to lift his suspension. And after Diaz appealed the suspension and fine, the Nevada State Athletic Commission decided to reduce Nick's suspension to 18 months and his fine to $100,000. Nick Diaz was free to fight again on August the 1st, 2016. But as of 2020, Nick Diaz still hasn't fought. And even though there was discussions that he was going to fight Robbie Lawler or Jorge Masvidal, I just don't believe it's going to happen, especially after being away from the sport for 5 years. So if he really is done with MMA, my question is, how good was Nick Diaz actually? In my opinion, I think Nick Diaz set the standard for what it means to be a true fighter. He showed the people what they wanted to see in a fight. We are in a sport where fighters execute game plans to earn points from the judges or fight strategically to avoid any danger. And that's understandable because losses and injuries can definitely be huge setbacks for fighters. But I don't think Nick Diaz cared because he was just happy to get in there, fight, and make money. Even the way most of his fights went down, they were mostly battles that saw Nick get into trouble at times. But he would find ways to earn the W no matter how much danger he was in. In 37 fights, he was only truly finished once, and that was really early into his career. Otherwise, he wasn't afraid to take hits. On his back, he would continue throwing strikes and looking for the submission. Instead of looking for that one powerful shot, Diaz popularized striking with volume. He was one of the most durable fighters ever with his strong chin and everlasting cardio. This would be the reason why he wasn't reluctant to move forward, which many admired as it showed how much heart and toughness this man had. In today's sport, there are many fighters who share this fighting spirit that Diaz has manifested. And they too receive the fan support and respect that Nick still gets today. He built a huge following because fans knew what to expect from him. And that was a war. My name is Kiiyon, and this was my take on how good Nick Diaz actually was. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put it in the comments down below because I love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But that's all I have for now, so I'll see you in my next one.